Mike's on Mike, a conversation about politics, government, and Jacksonville, with 50-year opinion leaders Mike Hightower, Mike Tolbert, and award-winning broadcaster and longtime political observer, Mike Miller.
Welcome to another episode of Mike's on Mike. I'm Mike Miller here in studio. My colleagues, Mike Tolbert, Mike Hightower, are at their respective remote locations, but we're glad to be with you today. We think you're going to like the next 30 minutes. Our guest today is our great friend, Andrew Pantazi, the editor of the Jacksonville Tributary, former Times Union reporter, and an investigative journalist as well. There's a lot we've got to talk about here today, Andrew, and we want to focus, of course, on recently completed primary election and the expectations for the general election coming up in November. So welcome back to Mike's on Mike. Great to have you here. Thank you for joining us, as always.
I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you. And Mr. Tolbert's going to kick it off for us.
Andrew, thanks for joining us. It's really good to see you. You know, we just had an election, a primary election on August the 20th. And I'm wondering if anything happened in that election that surprised you, or is there anything that stood out to you?
Yeah, I definitely think locally we did see two school board races decided in favor of candidates who'd been endorsed by Governor DeSantis and Moms for Liberty, which brings the number of school board members out of the 7 up to 4 who are more aligned with DeSantis. That had been a primary target for the governor. We saw the former Moms for Liberty chair in the most expensive race, covering much of San Marco and the South Side, did lose to incumbent Cindy Pearson. And that had been, of the races, the biggest target for conservative, more right-wing groups who are trying to target Cindy Pearson, who is more moderate Republican. And then on the West Side, we saw a runoff between Reggie Blunt and Hank Rogers in another race that conservatives had targeted for who's going to succeed Warren Jones. We also saw a circuit judge race that was really fascinating because it's the first time I've been covering judicial races for more than 12 years in Jacksonville. And I've never seen a Jacksonville judicial race that was like this, where there was explicit partisanship. There were mailers that went out that identified the party of one of the candidates and said, "You," in big, bold letters, "You can't trust her." It was very different than any judicial race I'd seen before. And the candidate who had been advertising herself as a conservative and advertising herself in more partisan ways lost that race. And so that, I think, a lot of judges breathed a sigh of relief. A lot of judges were worried that this could portend a new vision of judicial campaigning. And the fact that the person who was much less political in her campaigning, or much less partisan, I should say, in her campaigning, won, I think, for more institutionalists who would rather see the judiciary stay above partisan politics, we're quite happy with.
Speaking of which, before we move on, I want to ask this. I always thought that when you're talking about judicial races, that the rules, either by law or by the nature of the position, kind of tempers down the way campaigns are run. There are a lot of things that can't be done, as I understand it. I mean, I'll give you an example. When Audrey Moran, for instance, was running for mayor years ago, her husband, John, who's a judge, was not allowed to do campaigning with her, that there's very strict rules. Now, is that law, or is that just some kind of code of conduct or something of that sort?
So there's the judicial ethics and the judicial canons, which govern how judges are to behave, and they come down from the Florida Supreme Court. And the judicial canons say you can't be partisan, you can't be expressing political ideology or political ideas. But what they said recently, the Florida Supreme Court, they didn't change the rules at all. They just said those rules don't mean you can't say conservative, because that is not a political ideology. That is a judicial ideology.
Really?
And so when someone describes themselves as the only lifelong conservative in the race, that means that that person is a lifelong judicial conservative. Since they were a child, they were thinking judicially, I am a conservative. Here's my legal philosophy ever since childhood. And that's how they interpret the phrase conservative, that it is not a political phrase. And so we saw this.
Any way to know any way to know the consultant for the candidate that lost, the judicial candidate that went low and lost?
I don't know who the official consultant was for the candidate, but there was a political committee that was using the same address that a lot of these conservative candidates, a lot of the Tim Baker candidates use. It's the political committees all use one of 3 different addresses in either Tallahassee or Gainesville. And this was using one of those addresses that's commonly associated with the Republican establishment here.
Surprise.
It's all the same people then.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mike Hightower.
Well, one, Andrew, welcome back.
Thank you.
Sorry I can't be with you. Welcome back. By the way, our good friend Nate Monroe wrote lately wrote an article that the title was "DeSantis is out of juice." In that article, talking about school board, DeSantis was involved in 23 school board races throughout the state. 11 of the 23, his candidate lost. 6 got elected, but 6 are now in a runoff. My question to you is the DeSantis glow flickering or is it dimming? Andrew?
I definitely think the results were dimming for the governor. We saw not just school board races. We also saw, I believe it was 2 or 3 of the supervisors of election that he has appointed lost their races. We saw a lot of the school board candidates were also people who he had appointed to fill positions. And so they had the power of incumbency and still they lost. We saw in places, in conservative places like Sarasota County and across the state. We saw Lake County, the supervisor of elections there, the incumbent won against an election denier. We saw across the state pretty dismal results, even in conservative areas. And so that tells me that people, a good example locally, Baker County had a judge who was appointed by the governor. And she's the wife of I forget who the politician is that she's the wife of, but she was also up and she was up against a public defender. And in Baker County, that's not typically who you would imagine to be the type of candidate running for county judge. And she lost her race. And that's very rare to see an appointed judge lose their race for county judge. And so I think we're seeing across the state some candidates losing. It may be reflective of the governor choosing and appointing and endorsing people who are not locally connected or people who don't have as strong of local ties. And I think that even in conservative places that will vote for the governor in a gubernatorial race, they still have a sense of local pride or a sense of, we care more about local issues than state or national issues. And that definitely came through in these races.
Yeah.
I think the most, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Picking up on that, let me, if I can ask a little bit more. He's got 2 more sessions, Andrew, as you know, and you've reported on this, both you and Nate. He pretty much got anything he wanted out of the first 6 sessions. He's now a lame duck. He's got 2 more legislative sessions. What do you think? What's that look like? And then to pick up on what you just said, what does that look like for the new governor's race, which is 206, where he will be out of office? Do you see how the legislative leadership is going to support him or allow him to do what he wants? Or, the 2026 governor's race is going to start real quick. Where do you see DeSantis and all this?
Yeah, I have to say I'm very surprised. The governor 2 years ago won by 20 points, the largest Republican majority since Reconstruction. It was a historic and enormous political victory for the governor, and he got 2/3 majorities in the House and Senate, which meant he could approve public records exemptions without any Democratic votes, and he could approve constitutional amendments to go on the ballot. I'm honestly a bit surprised he didn't go for more wide sweeping changes in these last 2 years, particularly on the constitutional amendment front. They did put some that are on the ballot this year, but I'm surprised that he did not push through more conservative policy or more systemic change to Florida's government through that process. And now we're facing an election where polls show Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, while Trump is still clearly favored in Florida, it's much closer than the 20-point victory. And I think it's quite likely he loses those 2/3 majorities. And losing those means he's now not going to be able to push through quite as wide sweeping of changes. He'll still get legislation, but the constitutional amendments, I think, are going to be more off the table for him. I do think we're seeing the legislature start to get a backbone. We saw this with the proposal to give away state parks to developers. Very quick bipartisan majority, legislative leaders, Republicans and Democrats, congressional representatives across the state denouncing this effort. It's something that then Governor Rick Scott had proposed at one point and quickly backed down from. And I think we're seeing a weird shift from the governor where he seems out of touch with what's popular in the state. I think his first 2 years in office, he pushed through a lot of popular things like making cannabis smokable for the medical marijuana. We saw some environmental changes. We saw the pardoning of the Groveland Four. We saw a number of things that he was doing that seemed like common sense. These are things that everybody supports. And since then, I feel like we've seen just a slow erosion of this connection to what do actual Floridians want. And the state parks, I don't think there's many Floridians out there clamoring to give up state parkland to developers.
Not to put in a resort, certainly, and pickleball courts, no.
Yeah.
And that's what they're expecting. That's what they're thinking about doing for Anastasia Park.
Yeah, basically privatizing Anastasia State Park with, a private resort that is on public land.
One other election, if I can throw this in, that I found to be the most fascinating of all was that state Senate race where you actually had the endorsement of DeSantis on one hand and the endorsement of Trump on the other. I mean, that was an interesting race. They sure spent a lot of money on that. Boy, I haven't.
And the DeSantis endorsed candidate won there. Mm-hmm. But part of the result of things like that are you get more bad blood between the governor and former President Trump, who may be elected again. And having, they've got a tentative relationship right now coming out of a damaging presidential primary. If that continues, then you could see more direct opposition or direct fighting between the two of them. And we see right now, you mentioned the 2026 race. Congressman Gates beat back a primary of his own. He's one of the leading potential candidates, as is Congressman Byron Donalds. Both of them are fierce Trump allies. They supported Trump over DeSantis. I think that if they are seen as the rising Republican stars in Florida, if people start following them, they could very easily take fights against DeSantis as a easy win to say, look, we're not bought by developers or we're not, bought by the same special interests. I think that Matt Gaetz has a populist firebrand streak in him. I think he understands more what polls well. And I think that you could see him taking fights to DeSantis as a way to try to separate himself for the potential 2026 race.
You mentioned earlier some of the other races in school board, and you touched about the one about Becky Nathanson, who narrowly lost to Cindy Pearson. This was a repudiation of Moms for Liberty. What happened there? Why do you think? Was it the power of the incumbency, do you think, that just put them over the top?
I think I said this to you guys after the mayoral race, but I think we've seen a type of campaigning in Jacksonville that has been led by the strong political consultant class for Republican candidates who really believe that if you have more money and if you have more mailers, that's going to win an election for you. And that it all comes down to TV ads, radio ads, and mailers. And that there's been a neglecting of canvassing and the ground game in favor of that. And I think that also includes going to different groups that are holding forums. Becky Nathanson did not come to a forum that we hosted with the Jacksonville Public Education Fund and a bunch of other nonprofits. despite the fact that we arranged the time around her schedule. We changed the format of the forum after she requested, because we were really dedicated to trying to get her to come. And then she ghosted and flaked on us. And I think she did that to a number of other organizations, unless it was a friendly crowd, which means people who are already going to vote for her. She wasn't showing up. The problem with that is there are people who don't know how they're going to vote in a school board race, especially a school board race. These are the type of voters where someone can be persuaded by either side. And if you're only willing to go to your supporters, you're not expanding your base. And mailers alone is not enough to get people. I think you have to be willing to show your face, be willing to face hard questions, and be willing to meet voters.
Well, we'll save some of this for the postmortem of the national election coming up in November, but that can be said about even the national level of politics as well. The ground game is so important, and it's not being utilized as well as it has been in the past. Anyhow, let us move on, Mr. Tolbert. I think you're up next.
Yeah, Andrew, before we move on to the general election, I want to ask you about the Angie Nixon, Brenda Priestley Jackson race. I'm Facebook friends with Angie, but I don't really know her well. I know Brenda real well. Brenda, I thought she was a great member of the city council. I thought that she did a great job on the school board. I know at one point, instead of running for re-election to her district in 2023, she was thinking about running at large because she had an ambition to run for mayor. And I had conversations with her about this. She thought that if she ran at large and served at large, it would expand her base, it would expand her reach and give her a better opportunity. Then she ended up doing neither one of those things. She didn't run for a re-election to her district or at large. What in the hell caused her to get in the race with Angie and then lose? Angie gets 80% of the vote. How did that happen?
I think it's a lot of personal grievance. Former councilwoman, former school board member, Priestley Jackson, as you said, initially wanted to run at large. She did not raise any money outside of a couple of donations from Reggie Gaffney and Matt Carlucci. And then with the district, I think that she had a very sour relationship with the neighborhood groups that were in her district. There's a lot of neighborhood associations that really disliked her in her role as a district councilwoman. And I think that the feeling was mutual. And I think that was apparent when she would meet with them. I think that she is certain of what she believes, and so is unyielding in that way, which can be a very good thing, but it can also be a very tough thing politically. When it came to this specific race, a lot of it comes back to the city council redistricting. So Brenda Priestley Jackson oversaw a lot of the redistricting. When the redistricting was happening, Aaron Bowman was the official chair of it, but he said, we're going to let member to member, this is going to happen, and we're going to kind of divide up south and east of the river and north and west of the river. And Brenda led those meetings for the north and west of the river. And those were the districts that were racially gerrymandered. And when she was being confronted with this by the NAACP, by the Northside Coalition of Jacksonville, by our own reporting at the Tributary, she became very, very defensive, and she became very aggressive. And the way that she responded to the NAACP, that she was, I think at times insulting to the NAACP in her response. And at one point while she was tweeting, actually she was tweeting insults about myself and the reporting that I'd been doing, Angie Nixon replied saying the reporting was solid. And that's when Brenda started to quote tweet those tweets and attack Angie Nixon, saying that she was a bad representative for the area. During this race, her primary argument was that Angie Nixon has focused too much on fighting the governor, on being in opposition to Governor DeSantis, and not enough on constituent services, or not enough on bringing money back. Debating constituent services is really hard. It's really hard as a journalist. I can say I've not heard complaints from constituents saying that they've contacted the office and not been able to get help. Those were complaints I heard very frequently while Brenda Priestley Jackson was a councilwoman. And so I think that is a big factor is, are you, again, this goes to the ground game question. Are you listening to people? Are you in touch with where people are at? And I think people in that district don't mind Angie Nixon being placed in the basement of the Capitol building and, not maybe being able to pass as much legislation, knowing that she is the loudest opposition to the governor. When the governor vetoed the redistricting plan that and eliminated the congressional district that had been around since 1992 that allowed Black representation for North Florida, Angie Nixon's the one who led a sit-in protest, and she was punished for it. But I don't think people mind the punishment when, you can look at the alternative as Kim Daniels, who did much less well in her own primary against a much less funded and supported opposition. Kim Daniels can get a lot of legislation passed. She got past the removing school counselors and replacing them with chaplains. She got past teaching the Bible in schools. She's been, the face of a lot of abortion restrictions. She's been the face of a lot of pro-charter school issues. And so if you want to say the judge of a state representative is how much legislation they get passed, you can have a conservative Democrat who gets a lot of legislation passed. But that might not be the legislation that their Democratic voters actually want. And I think that was the argument that Angie made, and clearly the voters agreed with her.
Mr. Hightower?
Clearly.
That was fascinating. Thank you, Andrew.
Yep, it was.
You touched on it a little bit, Andrew. Let's talk about the general election in November. Since Vice President Harris has replaced President Biden, Democrats seem to have a renewed energy about their chances to win. I'm wondering if you are seeing any kind of changes in red Duval with Democratic momentum, and if so, what at this point?
So I haven't looked at voter registration to see if we've seen any signs there. I do think what we've seen in polling that's come out for statewide polling, we've seen that the race is tighter, but still Donald Trump has a clear lead, 3-4 point lead consistently in every poll. There's not really any polling that shows him losing in Florida. I do think we have seen a shift statewide. Whether that shift is permanent or not, and whether it can be held close or not, will remain to be seen. I also think, again, the down ballot effects of having a close race versus a 20-point victory are very obvious. Duval still, regardless if the state continues shifting to the right, Duval has moved to the left of the state, and that is new. That's new in my lifetime. I can remember 2000 and 2004 when we were 16, 17 points for George W. Bush in what were obviously very close races. We are now definitely to the left of the state. Even if Republicans win Duval this year, I am fairly certain that we will be to the left of the statewide average. I also think we'll have to see what happens in terms of campaigning. Is Harris's team willing to spend as much money as it takes to campaign in Florida? We're a really tough state to campaign in because you're not campaigning in one state. You're campaigning in 7 states. The way you campaign in Jacksonville is different than Orlando or Tampa or Miami or even Broward and Palm Beach are so different from one another. But I could see if there was one part of the state that makes more sense to campaign in. The benefit of Jacksonville is that Georgia is a battleground state. And if you come to Jacksonville, you get some spillover effects. Someone's going to drive from Savannah to go hear, Raphael Warnock and Tim Walz speak at a, Jacksonville event or Valdosta. You can get more spillover, and vice versa. If they're in Savannah, you might get people from Jacksonville willing to drive up and boost the momentum. And
I'm also wondering, too, in fact, I was listening to Chris Hand yesterday, or Sunday rather, on This Week in Jacksonville, and he was speaking about the referenda that are on, the 2 amendments. And what he thought was that with the abortion amendment, this would codify abortions in Florida and take away the post 6-week ban, if you will, and then establish a viability issue rather than by a certain week. He claimed that he thought the abortion amendment, which I believe is Amendment 3, is going to probably drive voters out to come out to vote. more so than what they would normally do. He said, and this was interesting, the marijuana one, which is Amendment 4 to legalize recreational marijuana in small amounts, he said that is so bipartisan, it's hard to see which party might benefit in the turnout when it comes to the marijuana issue, because there's so much support. I mean, Michael Binder's latest poll showed 69% in favor of the marijuana issue, while 64% were in favor of the abortion issue. But that just tells you how broad the appeal is for the marijuana issue compared to other issues that are on the ballot. And you can't really, I guess, prognosticate just what is that going to mean for voter turnout. It's much easier for the abortion one than the marijuana one.
Yeah, I mean, I agree on cannabis that I don't think, I guess my point would be more, I don't think people come out to vote because of cannabis initiatives. I don't think we've seen that. I think cannabis is one of those issues that has extremely high favorability. People want to see it legalized, but low salience. It's not a primary issue where people are like, in the same way that abortion is, this is the reason I come out to vote, is to do this. It's often a thing that people would like to see, but it's not something that tends to motivate them to get out to vote in quite the same way. I actually think that's one of the reasons Nikki Fried was able to get elected in 2018 as agriculture commissioner. That was a low salience office. I think there were a lot of Republican voters and independent voters who they get down to agriculture commissioner and they're like, I don't care who the agriculture commissioner is, but this lady says she supports weed, so I'll vote for her. I think that helps cannabis to pass. I don't think that necessarily helps with turnout. Abortion is different. I mean, abortion is something that motivates
really
people.
Emotional issue. It's really an emotional issue, much more so than pot.
And it motivates people on both sides.
Yeah,
I mean, I think there's a lot of people who maybe they would say, I find former President Trump distasteful, but they're very conservative. And this is the type of thing that gets them out to vote. Yeah. Just as I think it's true on the opposite side. People who maybe are not big fans of Vice President Harris, but feel very motivated by codifying the right to an abortion. We will see what happens. We haven't seen the campaign against abortion ramp up quite yet, but there is a lot of money going into it. And so we know there will be a strong campaign against the abortion issue. And so that could also be something that motivates the presidential races. Again, if you're the Harris team and you're like, is it worth spending all the money for Florida when Florida is moving to the right? Maybe this is something where you say, we support abortion rights. And so we're going to do this, even if it doesn't help our campaign, just to try to get this referendum across the finish line. Maybe that changes their calculus and spending more here, and that ends up boosting turnout as well.
Guys, we're really running late here. And if it's okay with you, can I take a point of personal privilege to let him promote something on the Tributary? You came out with this not too long ago. This having to do with a new web-based data tool program that you're going to give readers and elected officials, I guess, and journalists a little more information to be able to hold these elected officials accountable. Would you tell us a little bit about that in about 30 seconds?
Absolutely. We're in the final beta testing. We're going to be releasing this next month, but this is a tool that will allow people to see how their legislators are actually acting in Tallahassee. Right now, if you want to know how your legislator votes, you can't find that anywhere on the internet. This is going to actually show you not just bill sponsorships, but actual votes and how often your legislator votes against their party, against both parties, or with both parties or with their party. So it's going to give you a sense of who are the bipartisan, who are the independent, who are, the conservative Democrats or the liberal Republicans, and so on. And I think that's going to be really beneficial for people to see, are they in line with what I believe, if you want to know how they voted on the 6-week abortion ban or anything else.
Well, Andrew, real quick, are you going to do that for our local city council?
That was originally the plan. Was this started as a city council tool. I ran into some problems with the data. And so I was like, let me try this with the legislature first, because I think the data is better. And then after doing this, my goal is to release this for city council.
Very good.
All right, good. Anything we can do to help you with that.
Thank you.
Thank you for being
Money. If people could donate to the Tributary, it takes a lot of money to build these tools.
We're putting up a slide here at the end of the program to show you how you can get in touch with the Tributary and help them stay going. I mean, I don't know what we would be doing these 4 different times that we've had Andrew on to help us with Mike's on Mike, but we really want to help in the support of the Tributary, and we hope that those who watch and listen to our program will do the same. So do take down the information that's going to be on your screen. For those of you who are listening on Spotify, I'm sorry.
jackstrib.org.
There you go. That's all you have to do. Guys, thank you very much. And Andrew, Mike, once again, thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure. We want to thank our friends, of course, at the Jacksonville History Center, which is the Jacksonville Historical Society, for keeping the lights on and the cameras rolling, and the many donors who keep the show on the air. Thank you all for joining us. We hope you'll join us again next week. Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Y'all take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Mike's on Mike with Mike Tolbert, Mike Hightower, and Mike Miller can be found on your favorite podcasting platform, Facebook, and YouTube. Visit the website at mikesonmike.com. Join us next time for more conversation with Mike's on Mike.